The number didn't just land, it detonated. $2.8 trillion. When the statement surfaced, it ripped through financial desks, political war rooms, and newsroom control panels like a lightning strike splitting a quiet sky. Screens flickered, analysts froze mid-sentence, and within minutes the phrase was everywhere. A $2.8 trillion demand tied to Canada. Whether it was leverage, rhetoric, negotiation, or strategic theater didn't matter in that first breathless hour. What mattered was the shockwave, and at the center of it stood Donald Trump, once again proving that a single sentence from him could rearrange an entire news cycle before most people had finished their morning coffee. The air between Washington and Ottawa instantly felt heavier. Markets hate uncertainty, and this wasn't just uncertainty, it was magnitude. Trillions are numbers reserved for wars, pandemics, generational stimulus packages. They are not numbers casually attached to cross-border disputes, yet here it was, echoing across trading floors and diplomatic corridors alike. Commentators scrambled to decode the intent. Was it symbolic? Was it anchored in trade disputes? Was it a negotiation tactic designed to force recalibration? Every theory fueled the fire. Every headline amplified the tension. But across the border, the response did not come in panic. It came in poise. And that poise had a name: Mark Carney. Known globally for his steady hand during financial storms, Carney didn't rush to a microphone in outrage. He didn't match intensity with intensity. Instead, he allowed the temperature to settle just enough before stepping forward. And when he did, the tone shifted. His reply wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, it was controlled, deliberate, and razor sharp. In moments like these, volume is often mistaken for strength. Carney chose precision instead. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, a bold, headline-dominating declaration built to command attention. On the other, a measured counter that seemed designed to command respect. That clash of styles became the real story. This wasn't just about a number anymore, it was about philosophy. It was about power projection versus institutional steadiness. It was about how two very different approaches to influence collide when billions, and perhaps reputations, are on the line. As the hours unfolded, financial markets reacted first with nerves, then with calculation. Currency traders examined every word for clues. Bond markets searched for hints of escalation or retreat. Investors asked the only question that ever truly matters: what does this mean for stability? North America's economic relationship is one of the deepest and most intertwined in the world. Supply chains weave back and forth across the border like arteries connecting a shared heart. Energy, manufacturing, agriculture, technology, none of it exists in isolation. A shock of this size threatens to ripple through all of it. And then came another voice, one that carries weight not because it shouts, but because it rarely does. Warren Buffett has built a reputation on patience, discipline, and long-term thinking. When markets tremble, people listen for his tone the way sailors watch the horizon. His reaction wasn't explosive, it was cautious, almost clinical. He spoke not about emotion, but about fundamentals, about resilience, about the importance of measured decision-making when volatility spikes. In doing so, he subtly reframed the narrative. Instead of focusing solely on the confrontation, he redirected attention to durability. But make no mistake, the tension remained electric. Social media amplified every development in real time. Supporters of a hardline stance praised strength and leverage. Critics warned of destabilization and unnecessary escalation. The debate moved from boardrooms to living rooms within hours. That's the modern reality of geopolitics. Strategy unfolds under the glare of millions of eyes, each interpreting events through their own lens. Behind closed doors, however, the calculus was colder. A figure like $2.8 trillion doesn't appear without purpose. It's either symbolic muscle or a negotiating anchor set deliberately high to redefine the boundaries of discussion. Negotiation psychology often begins with scale. Start large enough and even a significant concession later feels like a victory. But scale can also provoke defiance. And Carney's response suggested something important. Canada would not be cornered by magnitude alone. His words emphasized sovereignty, partnership, and economic interdependence. He reminded audiences that strength in North America has historically come from coordination, not coercion. That message resonated beyond politics. Business leaders, industry groups, and provincial officials echoed similar themes. The subtext was clear: stability is currency, and currency, once shaken, takes effort to restore. As analysts dug deeper, they examined the broader context. Trade tensions have flared before between the United States and Canada. Tariffs, dairy quotas, lumber disputes. History is filled with friction points, but rarely has rhetoric attached such a monumental figure to the discourse. That's why this moment felt different. It wasn't just a policy disagreement, it was a test of narrative control. In Washington, supporters framed the demand as strategic positioning, a way to reset economic expectations and reclaim leverage. In Ottawa, officials framed the response as calm leadership in the face of provocation. Both sides understood something critical. Perception often shapes outcome as much as policy itself. And through it all, ordinary citizens watched. Workers whose livelihoods depend on cross-border commerce wondered what shifts might mean for their industries. Investors recalibrated portfolios, economists modeled potential scenarios ranging from symbolic standoff to prolonged dispute. Each possibility carried its own ripple effects. The most compelling element of this unfolding drama wasn't the dollar amount alone. It was the psychological chess match playing out in public view. Leadership styles were being compared not through campaign speeches, but through reaction under pressure. Trump's approach leaned into shock value, a tactic that has historically allowed him to dominate headlines and set terms of debate. Carney's approach leaned into stability, projecting confidence that markets and institutions would outlast any single surge of rhetoric. Buffett's quiet commentary acted almost like ballast in rough waters. He reminded audiences that economies are ecosystems, not headlines. That durability is built over decades, not days. His words didn't erase uncertainty, but they injected perspective into a moment tilting towards spectacle. As the first news cycle began to close, something interesting happened. The narrative matured. Initial panic gave way to structured analysis. What mechanisms would even allow such a demand to be formalized? What legal pathways existed? Was this an opening bid or a symbolic statement? The more experts spoke, the more nuance entered the conversation. Yet the emotional charge remained. Political allies rallied, opponents criticized, commentators dissected tone, timing, and strategy. Meanwhile, markets stabilized slightly, suggesting that investors believed dialogue would ultimately prevail over disruption. That stabilization did not signal resolution. It signaled expectation that cooler heads would shape the next move. But diplomacy is rarely a straight line. It bends under pressure, influenced by domestic politics, global optics, and economic data. As days progressed, both sides adjusted messaging subtly. The temperature lowered just enough to allow space for recalibration. Yet the memory of that $2.8 trillion headline lingered like thunder after lightning. For viewers at home, the story became more than policy. It became narrative theater with real-world stakes. Every new statement felt like another move on a board stretching from Wall Street to Bay Street. And each move carried implications not just for leaders, but for the intertwined economies they represent. The question now wasn't simply whether the demand would hold. It was what this episode revealed about the future of cross-border dynamics. Would bold declarations become the new norm? Or would institutional steadiness ultimately define the trajectory? In the space between those possibilities lies the heart of this story. A story not just about numbers, but about leadership under scrutiny, about the delicate balance between projection and prudence, about how quickly confidence can be rattled and how carefully it must be restored. The shockwave may have begun with a number, but its true impact was measured in perception. And perception, in politics and markets alike, is often the most powerful currency of all. Part 2. Approximately 2,200 words. As the dust began to settle, the deeper implications of the moment came into sharper focus. The $2.8 trillion figure had served its purpose. It commanded attention on a scale few political statements ever achieve. But sustaining attention is different from sustaining leverage. That's where strategy either crystallizes or collapses. In the United States, debate intensified around the rationale. Supporters argued that dramatic positioning is sometimes necessary to correct long-standing imbalances. They framed the move as bold negotiation, a signal that complacency would no longer define economic relationships. Critics, however, warned that unpredictability can erode alliances faster than it strengthens bargaining power. They questioned whether the spectacle risked overshadowing substance. North of the border, Canadian leaders emphasized resilience. Carney's follow-up remarks reinforced a theme of calm continuity. He avoided inflammatory language, instead anchoring his tone in economic fundamentals and institutional integrity. The message was subtle but powerful. Canada would respond but not react. That distinction resonated internationally. Global observers took note because this wasn't just a bilateral issue. The United States and Canada anchor one of the world's largest trading partnerships. Disruption between them can ripple outward into global supply chains, energy exports, automotive production, agriculture shipments. The interconnectedness is staggering. Any escalation carries consequences beyond politics. Financial markets, always forward-looking, began pricing in probability rather than panic. Analysts assessed historical precedent. They noted that high opening figures often signal room for maneuver. The more seasoned voices on trading desks pointed out that negotiations rarely end where they begin. The question became not whether the $2.8 trillion demand would be met, but how it would evolve. And then there was Buffett's steady presence in the background. His philosophy centers on long-term value creation, not short-term volatility. In moments of geopolitical friction, his influence often lies less in specific prescriptions and more in tone setting. By emphasizing patience and structural strength, he offered reassurance that underlying fundamentals matter more than momentary headlines. Yet even reassurance cannot fully quiet uncertainty. Political cycles operate on different timelines than economic cycles. Leaders face domestic pressures that shape their rhetoric and pacing. Public opinion can amplify or constrain options. Every statement is both external signal and internal message. In this case, the optics were particularly charged. A multi-trillion-dollar demand evokes imagery of seismic change. It raises stakes instantly, but it also narrows pathways if not carefully managed. That's why the exchange between Trump and Carney became such a focal point. It wasn't just about policy, it was about control of narrative momentum. Trump's brand has long centered on disruption as strategy. By redefining what is considered possible or acceptable in discourse, he often shifts the Overton window of negotiation. In contrast, Carney's career has been built on institutional stewardship. During financial crises, his credibility was tied to steadiness and evidence-based decision-making. The collision of those styles created tension not because one is inherently stronger, but because they operate on different wavelengths. As commentary deepened, experts explored potential off-ramps. Could the demand be reframed as part of broader economic recalibration? Might bilateral talks transform confrontation into cooperation? Would domestic political dynamics in each country accelerate compromise or entrench positions? Each scenario carried its own logic. Public reaction remained divided but engaged. Social media threads dissected every facial expression and phrase. Cable panels debated whether this marked a turning point or merely another chapter in a long-running pattern of rhetorical escalation followed by pragmatic resolution. Viewership numbers surged because uncertainty fuels attention. Meanwhile, businesses on both sides of the border adopted contingency planning. Companies reliant on cross-border logistics reviewed supply chain resilience. Executives weighed exposure to potential tariffs or regulatory shifts. Financial institutions modeled stress scenarios. Preparedness became priority. What made this episode particularly compelling was the layered nature of influence. Political messaging, market response, public sentiment, and institutional commentary all interacted in real time. Each influenced the others. A strong statement in Washington triggered reaction in Ottawa, which in turn shaped investor behavior, which then fed back into political calculation. Over time, the narrative evolved from shock to strategy. Analysts began focusing less on the raw number and more on the leverage it implied. Was the intent to extract concessions, to reshape trade frameworks, to rally domestic constituencies? Each possibility suggested different trajectories. Carney's continued composure suggested confidence that institutional processes would outlast rhetorical intensity. By maintaining consistency, he positioned Canada as predictable in contrast to volatility. Predictability can be a powerful diplomatic asset. It reassures partners and markets alike. Trump's camp, meanwhile, emphasized strength and accountability. They argued that bold demands reflect bold leadership and that without ambitious positioning, meaningful change rarely occurs. This framing resonated with supporters who view assertiveness as necessary in complex global negotiations. Through it all, Buffett's understated commentary functioned almost like a metronome, keeping tempo amid crescendos. He did not dismiss concerns, but he contextualized them within broader economic resilience. His approach reinforced a timeless principle. Economies are built on productivity, innovation, and trust, foundations that are not easily erased by a single dispute. As weeks progressed, incremental adjustments in tone hinted at potential de-escalation. Language softened slightly, meetings were scheduled, advisors signaled openness to dialogue. The spectacle of the initial announcement gave way to quieter, more intricate diplomacy. Yet the episode left a lasting imprint. It demonstrated how quickly modern geopolitics can accelerate from statement to global headline. It revealed how leadership styles shape perception as much as policy substance. And it underscored the delicate balance between assertiveness and stability. For audiences who followed every twist, the story became a study in power dynamics, not raw power, but narrative power. The ability to set the agenda, to frame the conversation, to steer interpretation. In that arena, both sides showcased distinct strengths. Ultimately, the $2.8 trillion shockwave may be remembered less for its literal feasibility and more for its symbolic force. It served as a reminder that in interconnected economies, rhetoric alone can move markets. That perception can create volatility even before policy changes materialize. And that steady leadership can sometimes neutralize intensity without matching it. In the end, the relationship between the United States and Canada remains anchored in shared interests too deep to unravel easily. Disputes arise, tensions flare, but structural interdependence exerts its own gravity, pulling parties back toward negotiation. This moment captured that push and pull in dramatic fashion. A bold declaration, a measured reply, a legendary investor offering perspective, markets trembling, then recalibrating, citizens watching, debating, engaging. The headlines may fade, but the lessons endure. Leadership is tested not only by the strength of its statements, but by the steadiness of its follow-through. Economies are influenced not only by policy shifts, but by confidence in institutions. And narratives, once ignited, must eventually reconcile with reality. The shockwave began with a number that seemed almost unimaginable. It evolved into a demonstration of contrasting philosophies under pressure. And as the world watched, it became clear that in modern geopolitics, influence is measured not only in trillions of dollars, but in trust, perception, and the discipline to navigate turbulence without losing direction. That is the deeper story beneath the spectacle. A reminder that while bold moves command attention, it is resilience and strategy that ultimately shape outcomes. The aftershock did not fade quietly, it evolved. What began as a headline-grabbing declaration started transforming into something more complex, more strategic, and far more consequential than a single news cycle could contain. The $2.8 trillion demand had already done what bold political maneuvers are designed to do. It captured global attention in an instant, but attention is volatile. It spikes, it surges, and then it either collapses or matures into leverage.
The real question now was whether this moment would harden into confrontation or reshape itself into negotiation.
In Washington, allies of Donald Trump framed the move as a calculated opening position, not a final destination. They argued that ambitious demands establish psychological dominance at the negotiating table. In high-stakes diplomacy, starting small rarely shifts entrenched dynamics. Starting big forces recalibration. From this perspective, the $2.8 trillion figure was less about literal transfer and more about resetting expectations, redefining the scale of discussion, and compelling counterparts to respond on unfamiliar terrain. It was disruption by design, but disruption carries risk. Markets may tolerate unpredictability in short bursts, yet sustained uncertainty erodes confidence. Investors, executives, and global partners began asking a deeper question. Was this a strategic anchor meant to pull negotiations toward a new equilibrium, or a symbolic escalation that could strain one of the world's most stable economic relationships? The distinction mattered immensely. Across the border, the response from Mark Carney continued to radiate steadiness. Rather than escalate rhetoric, he emphasized institutional continuity, economic interdependence, and the long-term durability of cross-border cooperation. His tone projected an implicit message. Strength does not always require spectacle. Sometimes it requires composure. By refusing to mirror intensity, he subtly reframed the confrontation. Instead of a clash, it became a contrast. That contrast began shaping international perception. Allies in Europe and Asia observed closely because the United States-Canada partnership serves as a foundational pillar of global trade networks. Any sign of fracture raises broader concerns about supply chain reliability and geopolitical cohesion. Energy corridors, manufacturing ecosystems, agricultural exports, these systems are not theoretical constructs. They are operational realities affecting millions of livelihoods. Meanwhile, the financial sector shifted from emotional reaction to strategic modeling. Analysts dissected potential scenarios. If negotiations intensified, what sectors would feel immediate pressure? If the demand softened into symbolic positioning, how quickly would confidence rebound? Currency markets reflected cautious recalibration rather than outright panic. That subtle stabilization suggested that investors believed dialogue would eventually temper rhetoric. Amid the debate, the quiet influence of Warren Buffett lingered like a steady pulse beneath turbulent headlines. His commentary, measured and deliberate, emphasized fundamentals over frenzy. He spoke of economic ecosystems built on productivity and trust, reminding audiences that durable value does not evaporate overnight. In doing so, he injected perspective into a conversation tilting toward spectacle. His voice did not dominate the airwaves, but it anchored them. Yet even as markets steadied, political energy remained intense. Supporters of a hardline stance saw validation in bold positioning. They argued that decades of incrementalism had failed to address perceived imbalances. From their vantage point, dramatic proposals signal seriousness. They believed that without ambitious demands, negotiations drift into complacency. Critics countered that sustainable influence stems from reliability, not volatility. They warned that alliances, once strained, are costly to repair. What made this episode uniquely compelling was its psychological dimension. Negotiation is not solely about numbers, it is about perception, leverage, and endurance. By introducing a figure as vast as $2.8 trillion, Trump forced the conversation into a realm of magnitude rarely seen outside crisis response. That magnitude alone reshaped media narratives, public discourse, and diplomatic framing. Even those who dismissed feasibility could not ignore scale. Carney's strategy, by contrast, leaned into asymmetry. Instead of contesting scale with scale, he reinforced predictability. His emphasis on economic fundamentals and shared prosperity suggested that time favored stability. In negotiations, patience can be as potent as pressure. By signaling calm confidence, he implied that institutional gravity would eventually draw discussions back toward pragmatic ground. As weeks unfolded, behind-the-scenes diplomacy intensified. Advisors and envoys exchanged proposals away from cameras. Public statements grew incrementally less combustible. The evolution was subtle but significant. High-voltage rhetoric began giving way to technical language about trade frameworks, regulatory alignment, and sector-specific concerns. That shift indicated recognition on both sides that enduring solutions require precision, not just power. Public engagement, however, did not wane. The episode had captured imagination precisely because it felt larger than policy minutiae. It was narrative theater with tangible stakes. Citizens followed updates closely, aware that cross-border relations influence employment, prices, investment flows, and national identity. The discourse transcended partisan lines, morphing into a broader conversation about how modern leadership navigates interconnected economies. Business leaders adopted contingency planning without succumbing to alarmism. Supply chain managers assessed exposure. Financial institutions reviewed stress tests. Energy executives analyzed contract resilience. Preparedness became proactive rather than reactive. This measured response underscored a deeper truth. Institutions built over decades possess shock absorbers. They bend before they break. Over time, the emotional intensity of the original announcement began to recede, replaced by strategic calculation. Observers noted that ambitious opening positions often create space for compromise that would otherwise be politically unattainable. If eventual negotiations yielded meaningful adjustments, proponents could frame outcomes as victories derived from boldness. If talks collapsed, critics would argue that escalation undermined trust. The stakes were reputational as much as economic. The interplay between domestic politics and international diplomacy added another layer of complexity. Leaders operate within national contexts shaped by public opinion, legislative constraints, and electoral cycles. Every external statement carries internal implications. Balancing assertiveness abroad with stability at home requires calibration. That calibration was unfolding in real time. Buffett's steady messaging continued serving as counterweight. He did not dismiss risks, but he contextualized them within a broader historical arc of resilience. Economies have endured wars, recessions, pandemics, and political turbulence. Against that backdrop, even dramatic headlines appear as chapters rather than conclusions. His philosophy reinforced the idea that patience often outperforms panic. Gradually, the narrative matured. Commentators began exploring what lessons this episode offered about 21st century geopolitics. One lesson centered on speed. In an era of instantaneous communication, a single declaration can traverse continents in seconds, amplifying volatility before institutions have time to respond. Another lesson involves style. Leadership approaches, disruptive versus deliberative, produce different ripple effects in interconnected systems. Ultimately, the tension between ambition and stability defined the moment. Trump's move exemplified maximalist positioning, designed to command attention and redefine scope. Carney's response embodied institutional steadiness, designed to reassure markets and reinforce predictability. Buffett's presence highlighted long-term value as the ultimate benchmark. As dialogue progressed, signs of pragmatic engagement emerged. Working groups examined sector-specific concerns. Economic advisors explored incremental pathways. Public rhetoric softened further, signaling recognition that cooperation yields more durable benefits than confrontation. The dramatic edge dulled, replaced by procedural complexity.